Welcome to the Primary Sources podcast from Viral History. My name is Joanne Paul, and I am here to chat with some of the world's leading historians. Not just about what they do, the bloody events they detail, but how they do it, and for goodness sake, why they do it. I'm interested in motivations and approaches, and how they came to find themselves buried in the past in the first place. Today, we are welcoming Dr. Adam Rutherford to the podcast. Welcome, Adam, and thanks for chatting with us.
Thanks, Joe. It's nice to be included as a historian there, because
You are officially now a historian. I think I have that power.
That is so great. It is nice to be included in conversations about history, because I really am not one, but I do write about the history of science a lot.
Well, we're going to come into all of that in a second. Just to introduce you briefly, for those few people who might not have heard of you, Adam has published 6 books. Is it 6? Am I right?
I think so.
Yeah, six-ish books. Okay. Yep, sure. On topics in the history of science. The most recent being How to Argue with a Racist. And we all very much need that one, as well as contributing to a variety of podcasts and documentaries. And he's a regular contributor to The Guardian. Best bit, he's also a fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and feel free to weave that into the interview however you like. That's how we got started. Chatting was on Twitter, exchanging Buffy gifs, I believe.
Yes, that's true. And I have to say, I was a little bit disappointed when you asked to interview me and it wasn't going to be about Buffy, but we can talk about science history if you want instead.
Well, I think it's in the title of the podcast. We're going to have to talk about some history, but any Buffy Easter eggs you want to throw in there, I think would be great.
I will endeavor to do that.
Now, as you said, your background is in science. You have a PhD in, and again, I'll get you to correct me if I'm wrong, the developmental genetics of the retina. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct, yeah.
But much of your publishing and public work has been around the history of science. Is your interest in history a long-standing one or something you came to later on?
Well, I stopped doing any sort of academic history aged 16 with GCSE history, and I've said before that if I was going to do it all over again, I think I would have stuck. I think I would have done. I'd just love to have done history A-level now. And when I went up to university, I actually went to study medicine because I didn't know what else to do. And I come from a sort of medical family, and I definitely had a scientific leaning. But I had no intention of becoming a doctor, so I actually tried to transfer to classics at UCL, and they wouldn't have me because I only had 1 A-level in Latin. So I did genetics instead. So there's a sort of, I imagine that there's a parallel universe where I became a classicist rather than a geneticist, because they did accept my my Latin A-level as a qualification. But since then, I think it's something which a lot of scientists who write in the write for popular audience, for public audiences, which is you can't help but get involved in understanding the history of one's field, partially because it's interesting. Of course it's interesting, but also because in order to understand the development of contemporary ideas, you have to know where those ideas, where the genesis of those ideas came from. And I think a lot of scientists get history badly wrong. So there's a great deal of humility required in being a science writer or presenter who is dealing with the history of their own field. Because of course there's a whole branch of history, which is the history of science. And I think often the relationship between historians of science and scientists who write about history can be fractious, shall we say.
I was just going to ask, are there difficulties in living this sort of cross-disciplinary life? Are there barriers that you encounter or only benefits?
Not so much barriers, I suppose, but I mean, one intellectual barrier is that just I think almost no scientists have formal training in doing history. And I think sometimes the more arrogant or perhaps less respectful scientists sort of are quite happy to ignore the fact that there is a discipline which is the history of their field, and it's history, not science. So we look at the that's happened in the past rather than the history of that field, if that distinction makes any sense. And I think a lot of scientists get the history wrong because they don't think very clearly about the context in which the research was being done, and only focus on what the research actually said in order to get onto the trajectory of what the research says now. So, you know, the history of science as a non, I mean that as the stuff that has happened in the past in science is a field as much as any which is dominated by, well, the way the stories are told is dominated by, you know, almost exclusively male major figures in that very sort of Whiggish way that history has tried to stop, you know, within the last 30 years. I think often the history of science as told by scientists just falls into those traps that, you know, first there was Newton, or wherever you want to start, and you can draw a line from Aristotle to Stephen Hawking without breaking the male line once. And of course, like history, science is much more complex than that, and as a result, it's much more interesting.
How has the history of your discipline helped you understand your role as a scientist better or differently?
Yeah, well, that is so fundamental to what it is that I do and what it is that geneticists do in general. And I think part of the appeal of my work as well, because as a geneticist or evolutionary biologist, those two things have a great sort of overlap in their Venn diagrams. It's a really young area, right? You know, you've got the biggest landmark in the history of biology happens in 1859 with Darwin's publishing The Origin of Species. And there's been a couple of other major landmarks since then. But then genetics, you know, the study of DNA doesn't really kick in until the mid-50s in the 20th century, although there's plenty of stuff going on before that. And then the Human Genome Project is 2001, right? So the study of biology has been going on for thousands of years since Aristotle. Taxonomy and classification, really the birth of modern biology, it begins to happen in the 18th century, specifically with Linnaeus. The revelation of the mechanism of biology happens in the 19th century, and by natural selection via Darwin and The Origin of Species. And the actual mechanics of it doesn't happen until the middle of the 20th century. So in terms of its history, it's incredibly shallow. And so to understand that history in terms of its relevance to what it is that we do today, it's absolutely essential, and I think not well known enough. But there's another aspect of it, which I think is really important for my work, which is that I spend a lot of time talking about two key ideas which are intrinsically intertwined with the birth of biology, and that is race science and eugenics, separate but overlapping. And there's a number of reasons why I've ended up talking and writing so much about those two topics, one of which is that I'm at UCL, which is where a lot of the development of scientific racism happened, and the actual coinage and main development of eugenics happened. And that's 100 years ago. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time talking about is how, even though human genetics is the one and only field which has demonstrated the concept of race is not biologically meaningful, but is a social construction, that only comes out of human genetics. But that's only 100 years ago that the idea was reversed. But so the echoes, the legacy of those ideas are present in society broadly, but they're very present in genetics as a field, as an academic field to this day. When I get off this call, I'm going to be editing a paper for a genetics journal on the language that we use in academic genetics, which still carries the hallmark of either sort of problematic terminology because it is rooted in scientific racism, words like Caucasian as a descriptor for Europeans, which was basically coined in the 18th century as some sort of reflection of white female beauty, right? And yet we still use it in academic genetics to describe European populations. So the legacies, the repercussions, the echoes of this era of scientific racism are very much present in our work today. So yeah, in answer to your question, hugely.
So you've helped us explain it. My next question was honestly going to be how to history and science, how have they been weaponized in the cause of racism? And I think you've already addressed that. What are some of the answers to counteract that? You've talked a little bit about thinking about the language, thinking about the history, but are there other ways that we can combine science and history to counteract the legacies that you've described?
Yeah, well, I think it's just learning it more than anything else. So, you're a historian, and I suppose the relationship between history and, I don't know, politics or the social context today is similar to the relationship between science that we do today and the history of science, in that it is possible to do science without any historical knowledge or context, but it's much better if you do. And I think that, a lot of my peers and friends and people inside biology have no, or have little or limited understanding of the history of our field, which is fine, fair enough, because they didn't go into these fields in order to understand that history. I argue in How to Argue with a Racist that that's actually not good enough, and that we have to know our own history in order to push back against the structural racisms that exist within society and exist within scientific research itself. There are social reasons for that, which we don't need to go into because they're kind of obvious, but there's also good scientific reasons for that, because recognizing that one's data set can potentially carry the baggage of structural racism means that you're not necessarily producing good data, right? So it doesn't serve your science well. And there's sort of very clear examples of that in genetics, where, for example, we're at a stage in history where we have literally genomes of millions of people around the world, and that allows us to look at the history of our species, migration patterns, disease modalities, all sorts of things. It's the richest data set that exists. And yet, one thing that many people are unaware of is that more than 90% of those genomes are of European people, and that we extrapolate that what may be true from analyzing European genomes to the rest of the world, which is a crazy thing to do, because there's much less genomic diversity within European DNA than there is, for example, in Africa, where there is almost all of the diversity of genetics is maintained. So if you don't recognize that, and if you don't understand why that is the case, that we have these hugely informative yet skewed data sets, then you're actually not necessarily doing good science, right? So I think the most important thing is that you just know where that history comes from, because it's like, I mean, in the past I've described it as being, it's a little bit like being an alcoholic, that the first step is recognizing that you have a problem.
Is there an argument there for training scientists in historical skills, or at least combining sciences and the humanities more in institutions?
Absolutely. I couldn't advocate harder for that. There's an element of learning the philosophy of science, but it's not mandatory in undergraduate degrees. There's an element of learning the ethics associated with science, but it's also not mandatory. And the history of science, I think, is further down the scale than those two. And again, to an extent, fair enough. People choose to do biochemistry and not to do the history of biochemistry because they want to become biochemists. But I do think that there is, as we become more and more siloed into ever more precise and precisely bounded areas of expertise, it's very easy to miss the bigger picture, or miss the context in which that research was created, or the history and the legacy of the field in which you're working, and also the people who did that work, who we're in a process, particularly at UCL, of reassessing the histories of some of the most significant players in the history of biology, which I think is necessary. And then one enters into the whole sort of public conversations about cancel culture is what people are calling it. And in fact, at UCL, we have denamed buildings and lecture theatres and professorships within the last year. And I've been part of some of those discussions. I think for the most part, the right decisions were taken, but they do have the effect of inflaming people of certain sensibilities. However, what I think is really important, and I teach very specifically, is sure, let's dename, but let's use these moments as pivots for understanding the history of the field that you've chosen to work within. The whole idea that pulling down statues erases histories is, to my mind, 180 degrees wrong. It is the creation of histories. Statues themselves, or the naming of a lecture theatre after some guy that you know nothing about, that is the opposite of history. That is the erasure of history, because they're contextless, right? They're just monolithic. This person was great. We don't know why, we don't know anything about them, but here's a lecture theatre named after them. But you dename that lecture theatre and explain why, and integrate why that decision was taken with sort of permanent displays, which is one of the things we're talking about at UCL, but also incorporated into your teaching, which I think is essential within my field specifically. And then everyone's a winner. No one knew who Edward Colston was outside of Bristol or academics working in that area until they ripped down his statue, right?
What I find really interesting in what you've just said and in what you've written about in some of your works as well is the way in which you've drawn a connection between a study of the past and lessons for the present and for the future. And of course, science, to me at least, has always been very future oriented. That's what it's about, to my mind. And I'm not a scientist, I am a historian, so maybe it just appears that way. How, in your view, can we use the past to understand our present and our future? And are there dangers that we have to be aware of when we're doing that?
Well, just to flip it around, like I said at the beginning, I'm a scientist and not a historian, so we can work together on that. And I think that is I've had such generosity from real historians in terms of helping me understand what it is I'm trying to do. And if you look at the acknowledgement sections of my books, half of those people are historians and not scientists, because I can kind of do the science, or I can do some of it, or understand some of it. But I need that reassurance from historians that I'm not saying things which are stupid, which of course is very easy as a non-historian to do. But the old maxim that if you don't understand the past, then you're doomed to repeat it. It's totally true in science, and we're doing that right now, right? So with new tools, by which I mean genetics and genomics, there is a huge, maybe huge is not right. There is a fringe but vocal group of people, mostly outside of academic genetics, who are effectively recapitulating the history of race science, but with a new tool, which is genetics. So looking at how people differ, how people vary around the world in populations and between individuals. But for the first time in history, we can do that with the actual metric of human difference and similarity, which is DNA, right? And in doing so, what I see is a recapitulation of stuff that we've been doing since the 17th century, which is trying to measure humans and then classify them into neat boxes. Now, when it happened in the 18th and 19th century, those neat boxes were the very clearly delineated races of man, the one that we still use to this day in a colloquial sense, sort of folk taxonomies. And as I mentioned a minute ago, genetics has shown that those categories are meaningless, or biologically useless. But what we are seeing, with access to huge data sets kept within our DNA, is that there is a sort of rebirth, a return, in a sense, of those ideas of race science. So I think one of the reasons that How to Argue with a Racist was popular was because it simply reflects that. It says, look, this is what happened in the 17th century with, Kant and Voltaire and Blumenbach and Linnaeus and those types of dudes. And this is what's happening now with DNA and with people like James Watson, who has repeatedly, is a figurehead in the field of genetics, having been one of the co-discoverers of the structure of DNA and a key part of the Human Genome Project, but is also a racist and comes out with racist things, which are both scientifically and historically illiterate. But then as a result of being propelled into the limelight for saying these things, becomes a champion of the cause of people who are saying, well, race is biologically meaningful, and here's a bunch of genetics and a bunch of geneticists who say so. So, that idea that we recapitulate the past with new tools, that seems very present in the science that I'm involved with today.
One of the coolest things to my mind that I noticed you saying was that DNA is the original and most fundamental historical source. In other words, genetics is a primary source. How do we treat DNA as a primary source? How can we learn history from it?
Yeah, I mean, that's really how I got into this, because the advent of easy gene sequencing, or being able to read genetics, which only really happened in the last 10 years or so, meant that we did suddenly have access to this record, which is kept in every single one of our cells, and which carries the history of our species, to a certain extent. There's lots of caveats within that, but it shows, it carries to a certain extent a record of every reproductive sexual encounter that all of your ancestors had, but it also carries evidence of disease, migration, of famine, even of warfare, and so there's all these markers in there. And one of the things I wrote in an earlier book, which was called A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived, was that unlike other historical sources, this is carried by everyone, right? So this isn't a history written by kings or queens or victors, or necessarily even the powerful. This is the, DNA is the ultimate leveler, because everyone carries it and everyone carries their own history. So access to that information gave us a new historical source. Now, at this point, when talking to a historian, in fact, when talking to anyone, this is the point where you have to display great humility, because as this field began to emerge, there were many cases of geneticists basically saying, our source is better than your source, right? So you've got stuff that's written down or carved in rocks, or archaeological artifacts, or whatever primary sources that you're using, and they're all subject to interpretation and stuff. But we've got this science version of that, which we can't change and is locked in our cells, and now we can read it. So whatever you say as historians, we've got this better data set. And definitely some scientists were a little bit like that, and it's a trap waiting to be sprung. And then I just spent a lot of time talking to historians who were mostly, almost exclusively, were like, this is great. You've got this new source, which was inaccessible to us until this year. What questions can we ask of this new source? We can check our history. We can check the validity of the sources that we've already got by looking at this new source. And so I'm very clear to point out that DNA is another primary source. It doesn't trump any existing primary sources. It should be used in parallel with the much longer standing academic study of the past, which is what you guys do. And so I get a lot of people coming to me and saying, what can DNA tell me about this person or this group of people? And often the answer is something, but not everything. And then you get some people coming to me saying, I study Mary Shelley, and we've got a hairbrush from her, which probably has hair from Mary Shelley's head on it. Can we sequence her genome? To which the answer is, well, possibly yes, but what are you thinking it's going to reveal about her? And mostly the answer to those questions is not very much. So it's another source. It has interesting validity. It can tell you great things about some people, but sometimes it's just, you must have sources that you look at and just go, well, you know what? It turned out it was a shopping receipt, and there's very little of interest in there.
I mean, that's 90% of the research I do. Absolutely. But I love what you're saying about contextualizing the source, because of course as historians, that's one of the first lessons we learn, is to corroborate our sources. That yes, you've got this source saying, that this person was doing X in this room at this place at this time. But until you double check that and have another source, you have reasons to question that source, that you really need to almost triangulate to make sure that is in fact telling you what it seems to be telling you. And you always need to sort of dig a little deeper and question and be critical of the sources.
I mean, the best example of that is basically the best story from the history of ancient DNA so far, and that's the re-identification of Richard III, right? So which I know everyone will know about, and was one of the biggest sort of history stories in the last 10 years or so. And I'm sure I don't need to recap it here. But whilst the genetics, which came at the very end of this process, confirmed without any reasonable doubt that the bones found in that Leicester car park were those of Richard III, that was the end of the process. But to get to that point, it was basically old school history, looking at maps, combined with modern scientific techniques like ultrasound, and comparing the ground layouts to the noises that it was making when you ping a laser down there, to old school archaeology, actually digging up bones, to forensic anthropology, actually looking and measuring those bones and comparing all of those things to what we knew about Richard from history and from fictional sources as well. And then at the very end, we managed to get DNA out of those bones and identify potential living descendants, compare them and say, yes, the chances of these bones not being Richard III is billions to one. And within that, you also reveal interesting things like the male lineage from the Plantagenets to the modern royal family is broken by a cuckolding event that we don't really know when it happened, but sometime around John of Gaunt. And this is something I've talked to Helen Carr about, who's been on this podcast. And she's got her book out like right now about that. The genetics says, I remember writing this at the time and saying, this is amazing, because what it shows is the current royal family is not biologically directly in the same lineage as the Plantagenets, right? Which on the one hand is absolutely shocking and hilarious. And, Buckingham Palace have yet to comment. But on the other hand, it doesn't make any difference in the history of things because the Tudors took over from the Plantagenets effectively via battle, right? I mean, they won at Bosworth, or Henry Tudor won at Bosworth, and that was the beginning of the Tudors. So again, the genetics says something which goes, well, that is interesting, isn't it? And in a historical context, it's like, yeah, but it doesn't actually say anything. It doesn't change anything. So I've spent the last 20 years being a geneticist telling people how unimportant genetics is.
Still sounds fairly important to me as a historian then, who's definitely not a scientist and definitely not a geneticist. How can I use genetics as a primary source? What are the ways in for genetics for a historian working well on any period, really?
Well, what's your period?
I am in the Tudor period, 16th century.
Okay. Well, that story, the Richard III story, is I suppose part of that. There is a limit to how old we can go with ancient DNA, right? And I suspect there won't be.
What does ancient mean in this context?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And in fact, that's quite funny you asked that, because we talk about ancient DNA in genetics as being basically anything which is not living, right?
That's different to us.
I know. And I found this out. I just never even considered it, because we've been sampling DNA from living things for years now, for decades now, but we've only been sampling DNA from dead things for maybe 10 or 15 years. And it all just gets called ancient DNA. And ancient can mean like, 50 years ago, or it can mean, I think the oldest is like now 100,000 years. We can't really get DNA out of things that are older than 100,000 years so far-ish. And I was in a seminar like 2 weeks ago, which was about genetic techniques to understand the peopling of the Caribbean and Mesoamerica. And I asked a historian, Caroline Dodd-Pennock, to come along to that, because that's her area. And they were just talking, it was all geneticists apart from one historian, her. And they were all talking about ancient DNA. And she texted me halfway through just going, when they're talking about ancient DNA, when are they talking about? And I was like, I don't know, like olden times? Like
very technical term, that.
Yeah, exactly. Centuries? I don't know. So it's a really good example of how, we get stuck in these sort of jargon terminology holes, and it just takes one historian, or in this case now 2 historians, to go, what do you mean by ancient DNA? Like, I don't know, old stuff.
don't remember what it was we were talking
Oh,
about.
you were asking me how it can help you. Well,
Yes, there we go.
yeah. Well, understanding genealogy and family trees is something that DNA does quite well. Genetic genealogy is different from genealogy, and understanding the complexities of relationships between large population groups is something that genetics can talk about quite well. There's a chapter in my last book about the inbreeding in the Habsburgs.
The chins.
Yeah, approach from an inbreeding, from a genetics inbreeding point of view, and that's one of my favorite lectures, and it's one of my favorite chapters I've ever written, because it is basically pure history, but with this layer of genetics. And I think what it says that's most important is that wait a minute, you can cut this bit out. What I think it says that's most important is that there is a fundamental relationship between families as decreed by reproductive sex, therefore genetics, and how history unfolds, right? So you've got the Habsburgs, who through 9 generations directly have resulted in the highest level of inbreeding that we've ever seen, and sterility in Charles II, right? But actually the inbreeding goes way further than Joanna and Philip Handsome, which is where that's a branch of the tree starts. And what we now know, what we've worked out, is that Charles II, El Hejidado, was more inbred than if a brother and a sister had a child together, right? And there's a metric associated with that. We call it the inbreeding coefficient. And if a brother and a sister have a child together, their inbreeding coefficient is 0.25. And Charles was 0.254, right? So he was doomed by his forebears, right? He was doomed to sterility and impotency, as written about in private letters from his 2 wives, by the behavior of his family in trying to maintain that chin, which was regarded as a badge of honor and divinity. They absolutely relinquished that power forever, because what follows from him not having an heir is the Spanish War of Succession and the breakup of the Habsburg Empire. So in this story of what is sort of founded in fundamental genetics is one of the biggest stories in European history. A 17th century understanding of biology results in a fundamental change in how our continent is broken up. And I just think that's incredibly informative. That's again, it's another source. It's recognizing that genetics is just the study of families and sex, and that's also basically the study of history, isn't it?
Absolutely. No, that's really fascinating. And I will think about the inbreeding coefficient every time I see the Habsburg chin here on out.
Well, here's a funny thing. So I'd written about that. I'd lectured about it a lot because it's a good story to tell, and there's new information about it that comes from the genetics. And Eduardo Habsburg, who is some sort of diplomat, I think in the Vatican, he follows me on Twitter, right? And I was posting all this stuff about the Habsburgs, and I feel like there's enough distance from Charles, who died in 1700, that one can be not. I mean, he lived a profoundly troubled life. He was disabled in ways that we can't even conceive of. And again, you know, in doing this in a lecture, it's highly entertaining. He couldn't retain food and drink in his mouth because his jaw was so prognathous. He had a little semicircular curtain around his throne, so people couldn't see him eating. He was impotent, and we think infertile, and he went very, very mad towards the end of his life and asked for his ancestors to be dug up so he could look upon their corpses. You know, not cool behavior at all. And this is all so this is highly entertaining from a sort of, you know, public history point of view, but it is as a result of generations of inbreeding, which effectively screwed that family forever. So when a living Habsburg comes to you and says, tell me about my ancestor, I'm like, okay. Now, he really liked the book, but yeah, it was a little bit awkward.
It's a very awkward episode of Who Do You Think You Are, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
I've got some quick fire questions for
Sure.
you. So obviously answer as quickly as you can, but feel free to provide an explanation. You're sat down next to Charles Darwin and you can ask him one question. What is it?
My question would be, dude, do you know how right you're going to be? Having at the beginning of this conversation, having sort of said that the Whiggish view of history is not very helpful and is a big part of science, I do think that Darwin is probably the world's greatest intellectual force that has ever existed. I know there's a huge bias in there, but
that's laying it down there. That's inviting Twitter responses.
I think a lot of my followers might agree with me. And he wasn't perfect, and but I think he's changed the world more than any other individual.
Your work has covered some 200,000 plus years of human history, so that's going to make the time machine question that much more interesting. What year do you set the time machine to go have an explore?
Wow. Do you know what? I'm going to refer to the previous question. I go back to 1836, just go on the Beagle down in South America. Maybe just point him in
Chuck Darwin.
Yeah, maybe nudge him in a direction so we might speed things up.
You've interviewed a wide variety of figures, from David Attenborough to the Vision himself, Paul Bettany. Which notable past or present person have you not interviewed and you'd very much like to? And this time you cannot say Charles Darwin.
Well, I'm midway through writing a book about the history of eugenics, and a big figure from my past and present is Francis Galton, who was Charles Darwin's cousin, by the way, who was a horrible, horrible man, but a genius with it. The man who invented the concept of, or at least scientific concept of eugenics. But he was a deeply, deeply racist bastard as well. So I think it would be interesting to sit down with someone who is so ostentatiously bright and also an absolute asshole.
Well, you've literally written the book on how to argue with a racist, so I feel like you would be well prepared for that conversation.
I hope so. I mean, I feel like that you might, because he was such a data-driven, sort of data junkie in many ways, I'd hope that you could say, look, take a look at what we've done since you were alive. Maybe it's, what do you think? Would you change your mind? I did a program with Natalie Haynes once, the classicist, and we talked about Aristotle, who was a great biologist as well as a philosopher. And Edith Hall pointed out in this program that they talked about how bad he was at women. And both of them agreed, and I don't know enough about it to comment, but both of them agreed that they reckon it would take about 10 minutes conversation with Aristotle for him to completely revise his view of women.
That would be handy. If they could go do that, that would be great. I teach a course on women in the political, and the first thing we read is Aristotle, and then we spend the rest of the course talking about how everyone else is referring to Aristotle when they, articulate their misogynistic views.
Yeah.
I think that's probably right, because actually a lot of the history of misogyny based on Aristotle is based on a misreading of Aristotle anyway.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know enough about his writings on women. I mean, I do know he did things like he got the number of teeth that women have wrong, which I just think is sort of fascinating, because in Animalia, he gets so much right and so much, incredibly detailed understanding or discovery about how biological organisms work, and then says some stuff which is just batshit, like dolphins snore when they sleep and women have fewer teeth than men. And you're like, dude, all you had to do was count and you'd be fine.
I guess no woman let him count her teeth. I guess
maybe not. Actually, you know what? Like, I mean, thinking about, I'm very interested in the history of anatomy. I did a series for BBC Four on anatomical art through the years, and Galen was another figure that I'd quite like to go and talk to, because he figures as the sort of the founding father of anatomy in many ways, but never dissected a human body, right? Or just worked on gladiators' injuries, but mostly based his work on chimps and baboons, and certainly wasn't allowed to investigate women. So again, it's another one of those situations where you think, there's a lot of dead people around. Maybe just have a quick look. Just maybe have a little, just bit of slice and dice, and we might make some progress.
So it's fascinated me with medieval and Renaissance art, as you say, this is when they're starting to understand anatomy. They are carving up cadavers, yet they still can't draw female breasts. That seems to mystify them. It's very, very late until you actually start to see where they're not just sort of melons stuck onto things.
Yeah, I mean, Leonardo is particularly bad at that. And
very,
I think
very bad.
There may be other reasons for that, but his famous, the viscera of a woman, where basically the top half is sort of okay, lungs and heart and stuff, and then there's this incredible drawing of what he had of the uterus, except it's complete. The first time I saw it, which is as an adult, I looked at it and just went, well, what's that? Right, because that doesn't look anything like a uterus whatsoever. And the art historian who's the curator of the Queen's collection, who has all of the Leonardo anatomical drawings, Martin Clayton, he said, well, it's based on a cow, right? Because he was allowed to do cows, but he wasn't allowed to do women. And so the uterus is it looks like something out of Alien, right? The film Alien. And so there is this sort of mass in the middle, which is almost like a horned face. And it has these 7 suspensory ligaments, which are hanging it in place. Now, that is what cows have, because cows have enormous interiors. And so their uterus is effectively hanging in there. But I'm telling you, you do not have a suspended womb that is hanging from ligaments that are attached to your ribs or your interior. But that's what Leonardo thought.
It explains so much about women's medical history. All right. Sort of speaking of which, last quick fire question. You can remove, I'm going to say it again. You can remove one unscientific notion from the world right now, whether it be for flat earthism, homeopathy, creationism, whatever you like. What one would you immediately strike from the earth, and why?
That's easy. And the answer to that is racial taxonomy. So a fun game I've asked of my students in the past is a sort of hypothetical. If we had discovered genetics, this is impossible, of course, but if we had discovered genetics before, like anthropology, and it was disassociated from European colonialism and expansion in the 17th century onwards, if we had discovered like I said earlier, the true basis of human difference and similarity, would racism exist today in the same way? I don't know the answer to this, but I suspect the answer is, the context for this is that, bigotry is eternal, but the racism that we endure today is intrinsically and fundamentally bound to the invention of race in the 17th century by European scientists and philosophers. And so if that hadn't have happened, what would the nature of bigotry be today? And would it be along the same lines that we see it? I think probably not. And I think that because the racial classifications that we use today as folk taxonomizations, folk classifications, only really date from the 18th century onwards. And while differences between populations, which include pigmentation and hair texture, exist in the past and in classical history, they're mostly concerned with cultural, religion, geographical differences. And so sometimes when I get into arguments with idiots, they say, are you saying that racism didn't exist in the past? Try telling that to the Romans. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that, that it would have been an awful time to live if you were anything other than middle or upper class Roman, a middle or upper class person in that time, right? Because bigotry and warfare and bloodshed and all those things existed in spades, but they weren't along the same lines that racial taxonomy and racism exists today. So yeah, so the quick fire answer, these are not quick fire answers, are they? I mean,
You
you're
were
asking quick
answering quickly.
questions.
That's fine. Especially that one. I was just surprised how quickly you answered that one. That was quite easy.
Yeah, just erase that attempt to classify humans along the lines that Linnaeus and Voltaire and Kant tried to do, and then see what bigotry looks like today.
3 final questions. These aren't quick fire, so you don't have to answer very quickly. What is your favorite primary source that you've engaged with?
That is on my shelf right behind me. No, I think I moved it downstairs. I'm currently reading a book from 1938 by JBS Haldane, who was I think the greatest 20th century biologist, but one who is not well known, a fascinating character. But it's called Heredity and Politics. And it's an example of, you asked me about history recapitulating itself and knowing our history. The number of times that people tell me that science shouldn't be political. And when Scientific American and Nature and the journal Science all endorsed Joe Biden in the last election, Twitter went mental for that, just going, you can't, science is apolitical, you shouldn't be making these statements. Science has always been political, right? It's inextricably bound to politics. In the invention of race, right? Science evolved in service of European expansion, not in parallel to it. Racial classifications were designed to justify the subjugation of people. So anyway, so I'm writing about eugenics, as I said, and Francis Galton is the big bogeyman in this field, and he's my sort of academic great-grandfather, because I'm still at UCL in the department that he effectively founded. But JBS Haldane was a very different character who, not without fault, but he largely opposed ideas of eugenics that were very popular at that time, right? And were sort of cross-politically supported. I find it very difficult to understand. I think everyone finds it difficult to understand how popular an idea eugenics was up until the events of the Second World War were better known, across the political spectrum, across class divides. But there are people who push back against it. And in Heredity and Politics, Haldane talks about a number of things which are really, really interesting and very far-sighted, including why he thinks it wouldn't work for scientific reasons, eugenics as a policy, and also why it wouldn't work for human interest reasons. He cites, there's a very funny footnote, which I wish I could show you, but the book's downstairs, where he lists people who wouldn't have existed if eugenics policies had been enacted. And they include, in the list, he says Beethoven and Jesus. And the footnote says, footnote 6, he was deaf. Footnote 7, he was poor. I think that's a pretty compelling argument.
Holy Spirit, though, doesn't come into the fact that
No, he didn't mention the Holy Spirit.
It doesn't mention that part. Immaculate conception and all that. All right, penultimate question. What are you working on next, if you're allowed to tell us?
Yeah, sure. So, well, the eugenics book is I'll be submitting that in July, and that comes out in February. I've just finished a book which comes out in October, and that's written with my presenting partner, Hannah Fry, who's a mathematician. And that's very much a more fun sort of history of science. It's called Rutherford and Fry's Complete Guide to Absolutely Everything. So that's the more accessible version of my work.
That sounds very sort of 19th century itself.
Yeah, there's definitely a
something
turn.
that would be sold off the back of a, I don't know, a traveling wagon or something.
Oh yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Sort of roll up type.
Yeah.
It's complete. Well, I think one of the good things about having a name like Rutherford is it does sound a little bit like you are, Rutherford and Fry sounds a bit like a butcher's or maybe a law firm from Dombey and Sons or something like that. So that's out in October. And then I'm actually contracted to write 4 books at the moment, which is a bit daunting. I'm doing a young readers version of my race book, which I'm getting a young adult author to write with me, because I don't know how to write for children. So I want that to be shared. And then the big book, which comes after that, is the complete history of the universe.
You're not unambitious.
Not unfoolish either.
Well, there you go. So we'll have answers to all our questions about everything ever by sometime next year. So we can look forward to that.
Yes. Yes. Actually, I didn't mention that Rutherford and Fry's Complete Guide to Absolutely Everything, there is an asterisk on the word everything, which is at the bottom. It says abridged. It's doing a lot of work.
Definitely legalistic then. You're covering your bases.
Yeah, absolutely.
What advice would you give to a historian just starting out?
To a historian?
I think you should. Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think I'm qualified to give advice to historians.
Just given me lots of advice, so and I'm very grateful for it.
Well, you know, when I was doing that series I mentioned about the history of art, which I was approaching from a sort of scientific point of view, but we were talking about artists. Basically, episode 1 was Galen, episode 2 was Leonardo, episode 3 was Rembrandt, 4 was the Hunter brothers and sort of 19th century grave robbing, and the final episode was about Grey's Anatomy, right? And when we were doing Rembrandt, I was doing an interview, and someone was saying, I'd read how someone was talking about a particular aspect of the way that the body, the cadaver in the anatomy lesson of Nicholas Tulp had been arranged, right, which is basically lying sideways on. And the suggestion was that this was a direct reference to an earlier Caravaggio and references to Christ, right? And my sister is an art historian, and I was talking to her about this, you know, slightly apologetically, going, I'm really sorry I've encroached on your turf here, but here we are. And she said, the most important thing is don't ever say anything that you don't have direct evidence for. And it was a bit of a sort of epiphany for me, because it was, you know, that's science. And I think that all of the historians that I interact with, who I enjoy interacting with, have that same principle. And in that regard, I think of history and science as being much more closely aligned than they are. We're looking at evidence, and then what comes after that is contextualizing that evidence and where it comes from and what it predicts in science. I suppose a little bit more than in history, but I'm sure there is sort of predictive power in history as well, right? So I think maybe it's my sister's advice. Don't say anything that you don't have direct evidence for. What do you think of that?
I think that's perfect. I think that is something that I would like to make sure that my students understand. Conjecture has its place.
Yeah.
You know, you were talking about a counterfactual earlier, this idea of thinking about, well, you know, what if history had been different? I think that is important because that helps highlight the evidence that we do have. But yes, 100%, I would agree with that, and corroborate your evidence, as I was mentioning earlier, and critically engage with it.
Yeah. What do you think about counterfactual histories? Because I know that some historians really like them as an idea for exploring ideas, as a way of exploring ideas, but I know that some are hostile to them.
I've never been hostile to it, and I think it really does have its place. I think thought experiments in general can be very helpful, and that's just an example of a thought experiment, isn't it? I had a great conversation with Susanna Lipscomb, who we're going to have on the podcast very soon, and she was writing an article about, I think it was if Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon's son, who only lived, I think it was 8 months, if he had lived, essentially, if he hadn't died in infancy, and what it would have looked like. And, you know, two historians who work on the 16th century just throwing that back and forth, it was really, really fascinating. And it really helped us highlight some moments in history that happened. You know, they weren't counterfactual, but they're often overlooked. and how those would have become more important, and how certain figures might have become more important. And in fact, therefore, well, they are important actually in the history that we do have, but they have been overlooked by the way in which we tend to narrate that history. So Anne of Cleves actually ended up being incredibly important to this counterfactual in a way that she is often overlooked in the way that we tell, the Six Wives of Henry VIII. So I think it can be very, very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that sounds right to me. And also it makes it more fun as well, right? I mean, you can.
Oh, it's great fun.
Yeah, you can speculate. Do you do that with your students? Do you ask them to think about what would have happened if? Because in science, I guess, if the principle of science is to remove the subjective and to reveal objective reality, there are notions which are, I bang on about how great Darwin is, right? But we also know that Alfred Wallace came up with the basic principles of natural selection at the same time, and that actually prompted Darwin to publish. It isn't Wallace's theory, and I know people like to think that it is, but the point that makes is that these things are waiting to be discovered, right? And if Darwin hadn't have existed, we still would have discovered evolution at some point after 1859. Well, in fact, Wallace would have outlined it, because there is a fundamental truth that underwrites that. And I suppose history is different, that if people don't exist or behave in certain ways, then those things don't necessarily come to pass.
And yeah, I think the other thing that counterfactual does is really highlight the contingency of history, which is something we can overlook. Again, thinking about this sort of Whiggish approach to history and the sense of grand narrative, and that the way things worked out is the working out of some great plan, rather whether divine or otherwise. But just recognizing how contingent and precarious and random history can be, I think, is really highlighted by counterfactuals. But it's interesting what you were saying about ideas or scientific realizations would have, been encountered. Really, my field is intellectual history, the history of ideas, and I think we can say similar things sometimes in the history of ideas. And of course, the history of ideas overlaps with history of science fairly frequently, certainly around race. We work on Voltaire and his ideas around race, just
Which
as
are
fun.
not pleasant.
Not very pleasant at all. I'm
Yeah.
most suspicious of people who quote Voltaire at me.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I gave the Voltaire lecture 2 years ago for the British Humanist Association, and received the Voltaire medal, the only medal I've got since my bronze swimming certificate. And I made a point of saying in the lecture, of saying what Voltaire had said, and what I was talking about race. I was talking about the book, and I was saying that and this great hero of the Enlightenment, so often cited as one of the founders of Western thought and freedom of thought, which is a key idea in the history of ideas, was a shocking racist, even contextualized within his time. He was a polygenist. He thought that African people were a different species from white Europeans, and vocally expressed that on multiple occasions. And then you get into the whole conversation. Well, did we cancel Voltaire now? No, of course not. We just need to know these things, that our heroes are complex and interesting, and we're better off knowing these things than not, right?
Yeah, don't cancel, contextualize.
Right.
my sort of response.
Yeah.
But yeah, similarly, stuff around sort of secularism and freedom of religion is often very, very rooted in anti-Semitism. When he criticizes religion, he's often criticizing Judaism. And you don't get that unless you look at the whole page, as opposed to the one little fragment that people like to quote and put into a meme.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I came across that many times during the writing of the race book, because I was talking about, there's a section on the history where I talk about Voltaire and I talk about Kant and Blumenbach, and then I came across this guy that I didn't know, but who's called Gottfried von Herder.
Oh, Herder. Yeah, I've read Herder.
Okay, so I hadn't, and
Yeah.
Um, and I was reading some of his, so he was sort of Kant's antagonist in discussions about race.
Yeah, he's considered counter-enlightenment.
Right, right. And
Yeah.
some of the things he says about human history are like 200 years ahead
Yeah.
of where everyone was at that time. He talks about the history, he talks about continuity of races, that there aren't any discrete races, and that none of these characteristics in the races are innate or could be changed, which is a very Darwinian idea. He talks about how the differences you see in people around the world are a reflection of human geographical history, which is exactly correct. And I was like reading this and going, shit, this is amazing. This guy is so far ahead of his game, and appears to be well, not anti, but he appears to be not endorsing the heavily racialized classification groups that are becoming the prominent model at that time. I was thinking, God, von Herder's my new guy. And then I read what he thought about Jews.
Yeah.
And it just went, okay, yeah.
Yeah, that is the problem with a lot of them. But he's really interesting. If I haven't read him since I was in undergraduate, and I read him on this wonderful course that was sort of, standard history of political thought, except it was run by one of the very few women in the department, because it's a very male-dominated field, and she had us read a few that were not as typical part of the canon, and Herder was one of them. And yeah, if I remember rightly, he was arguing, well, one of his contexts was sort of arguing against Prussian oppression, and so he had this very sort of counter and resistance sort of view against this Prussian attempt to unify and homogenize. And so diversity was very interesting to him. But I'd have to explore him again, because it has been, I'm not going to say how many years it's been since my undergrad, but it's been some years.
Sure. It was just a bit of a revelation for me, because
Yeah.
it was such a different voice from the ones that I was hearing, and he basically gets shouted down by Kant, who's
Yeah.
the big cheese and wins in those discussions. I spoke to a colleague in Germany, and she said, oh yeah, Herder's a huge figure over here, and I just felt slightly embarrassed that I'd never even heard of him, which is certainly my own ignorance. But
Well, it just goes to show how important the canon becomes.
Yeah.
Who you encounter becomes who exists.
Yeah.
And that's why it's, I think, so important to question and challenge and diversify the canon, because otherwise we just don't hear other voices. And then there is a sense of inevitability about history, because they all sort of talk to each other, and that's all we hear. And we don't understand that there were alternative views. This idea of, well, we shouldn't push our values on the past. We shouldn't judge them for their racism or their various moral failings. Well, there were people criticizing them at the time too. We just often don't hear those voices.
Well, that is exactly what I was talking about with Haldane.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's true and justifiable. You can evidence the idea that that support for eugenics was cross political and cross class divides. But that doesn't mean there weren't dissenting voices, which there certainly were. And Haldane's is I think, a very interesting voice in that conversation, because he says it's not merely political. He's arguing from both a scientific and a political point of view. I mean, he was an odd chap. He was started off he went to Eton and went through that route, as so many academics did at that time, but then became a communist and became a Soviet communist, and ended up living in India as a sort of Buddhist communist, and has some deeply problematic support for Stalin well into the 50s, whilst at the same time sort of maintaining. He was a great popularizer of science as well, and used to tour working men's clubs in the north of England with some of his early. Well, we think of science communication with people like Brian Cox and Alice Roberts and me to a lesser extent as a modern phenomenon, when actually it's Haldane was doing it in the 1930s, and and Faraday was doing it in the 19th century. Here's a great factoid for you, which you probably know. The first one-way street in London, and I think the world, was
No.
Albemarle Street.
Which one, sorry?
Albemarle Street in Mayfair. And the reason was, that's where the Royal Institution was. And the reason was because so many people were queuing up to see Faraday give his lectures at the Royal Institution that it was screwing up the traffic. So the mayor turned it into a one-way street. Now, I've said that to a historian now, and I'm desperately anxious that that may be just completely made up. But I think I'm going to stick with that.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap us up, this fascinating conversation. But thank you so much, Adam, for taking the time to introduce us to a whole new way of thinking about both history and science. It has been utterly fascinating. Just a reminder, if you want to hear more conversations with history makers like Adam Rutherford, do subscribe to Primary Sources Podcast and follow us and Viral History on Instagram and Twitter, where you can also suggest future guests and send along quickfire questions to grill them with. Thank you for listening to Primary Sources.